everyone, so today's video is an interview I had with Yazan al-Saadi, a Syrian-Canadian writer and researcher based in Beirut. So I'm so excited to have Yazan here to talk about the Syrian war and answer a bunch of my questions. In this interview, he raises so many important topics ranging from his views on US intervention to problems in the mainstream discourse about Syria, both on the left and the right, to Assad and imperialism and lines of action that we should be prioritizing to help the Syrian people. Yazan was very recently interviewed on Democracy Now! Following the military strike that Trump commanded on a Syrian airbase on April 7th. So I'll also be interspersing short clips of that interview throughout our conversation. Yazan al-Saadi's writings and research work can also be found on various other platforms like Al-Akbar English, Mufta, Receive 22, and Lebanon Support. So all of that will be linked in the description box below, and if you enjoy our conversation today, I definitely encourage you to go check it out. And without further ado, let's get into it. So Yazan, thank you so much for coming on the show. The reason that I wanted to have you on, and I'm so excited to have you here, is because I would like to ask you about like a Syrian perspective on everything that is going on and everything that we're hearing in the media. And I would really like to recenter the conversation around like Syrian people and what can be done to help them, but also like what your take on all this dialogue is.
So before I say anything, I have to be clear. When I talk, I'm usually I'm talking for myself, so I can't really talk on behalf of Syrian people or Syrians in their entirety, because that's simply impossible. There's around 24 million Syrians. Each one has their positions and their beliefs and their desires. So I take that into account. When I speak, I tend to speak based on my own bias, my own opinions that I have gained over time as a Syrian individual who also has a Canadian passport, and my work as a journalist and a researcher and in NGOs. So that's the basis of where I come from, and I think that is always important to state and explain, because in general, when people talk about Syria, they tend to talk as if they own Syria, or they talk in a sense of entitlement. And I think that is one of the core problems in the discussions. Even Syrians themselves, when they talk about Syria, they are presented as the voice, the narrative, the only thing, which is problematic in so many ways. So that's one thing to take into account. I mean, the best way to talk about Syria is to acknowledge that there is many Syrias, or many Syrians, and many versions and many ideas and solutions that are in play. But at the same time, we can't forget the realities on hand and the dynamics that have been going on for a long time, even before 2011. Sounds complicated, but it also is quite simple.
So let's go to Lebanon right now, to Yazan al-Saadi. Your response to the first U.S. attack on the Syrian military base after the Tuesday chemical attack in Syria?
Well, my first response is that I personally don't think it's going to matter much in the long term. I think it's simply a symbolic attack. Let us not forget that the U.S. has told the Russians beforehand that they were going to do it. They hit a lone air base. This won't really damage the capabilities of the Assad regime to do what it's doing. I also would like to highlight that regardless of the fact that it's the first so-called U.S. response on the Syrian regime, the U.S. has been bombing Syria since 2014, killing hundreds of civilians. So for me, I would have to disagree with my other guest, Adia, in saying that this is a positive thing. There can be nothing positive, nothing at all, from the US regime nor the Russian regime in their bombings and invasions of Syria. Let's be honest, both these superpowers with other reactionary forces in the region do not give a damn about Syrian self-determination nor justice for Syrians, like they don't give a damn about other communities in the region from Bahrain to Yemen to Palestine. So I have no hope with the Putin regime or the Trump regime and whatever they do.
They can say whatever they want, but their actions have proven that they really don't care. And they were just, it's basically barks between each other. And it's not really going to matter much for the people on the ground who are dying.
So the actual function of the strike really didn't do anything on the ground, and I think it created a sort of theater play. I mean, a shadow play, I should say, where Trump was showing that he is doing something when he's not really doing something, and everyone that is playing is actually gaining, and the only people that are losing are the Syrians. And I'll explain what that means. I mean, Trump gained in the sense that he showed he is a man of action, and therefore everyone fell in line, and you can see that from the media, from different political groups, from everyone, everyone just tiddled along. Secondly, Russia gained because it showed that it stood up for Syrian sovereignty, and it really didn't damage anything the Russians are trying to do there. And the Syrian regime gained because, they continue doing what they can do. They aren't really being threatened with complete overthrow. The U.S. isn't launching anything more. And it showed to its allies and its constituency that it's against imperialism. And I think that is a facade, How everyone reacted to what happened, I think, is very interesting. I mean, there is a lot of sensationalism about World War III, which I think is frankly BS when you look at reality. There is no World War III. And I think this sense of hysteria kind of pulls everyone into line, ideologically speaking. They stop thinking. And at the same time, it also is a continuation of the problem that media has presented Syria, which is basically every event happens in every couple of months as a spectacle, disconnected from what was happening over time and space. And I think that is a big problem, and it really harms any type of thoughtful and comprehensive analysis on Syria. And it also ignores the Syrian positions. I mean, let's be honest. From the perspective of Syrians that I've heard, there are those that supported the strike and those that are against the strike. And they are that for many reasons, some of them valid, some of them are not. And we need to take that into account in our conversations as well.
So next, I asked Yazan about the dominant discourse that we hear about Syria, which usually falls into two camps. On the pro-war side, we hear that Western military intervention is required to defeat Assad and his brutal repression. On the other, we hear that criticism of Assad or call for foreign intervention is negative and essentially advocating for a continuation of imperialism. So I have to admit that I myself have been confused by these two schools of thought, and it makes me quite intimidated to talk about the Syrian war in any sort of political terms. For Yazan, both of these sides are overly simplistic and fail to center what truly matters, which is the liberation and self-determination of the Syrian people. So let's take another quick look at his interview with Democracy Now! And continue our conversation.
And there continues to be a big problem in the discussions of Syria where geopolitics and ideological lines are defining over and beyond the rights and dignities of people. So this has been going on, and it's still going on till this day. The conversations about the U.S. bombing of an airfield in Syria has generated a sense of hysteria. Some people, that so-called anti-imperialist front, are saying this is the beginning of World War III, which is a ridiculous statement. And other people say this is the first time America has intervened in Syria, and this is not true. The Americans have been intervening in Syria for a long time in various ways, not really against the regime, and I agree with Alia there. It is not in their interest to promote and develop self-determination of Syrians. And it's a clear policy they have for the entire region. Let's look at the bigger picture here. And when I say the bigger picture, I'm talking about not the simple anti-imperialist or geopolitics discourse. I'm talking about what about self-determination for all the communities? Because what's happening in Syria is part of a process. This latest chapter that started in 2011 is part of a regional chapter that we saw erupting from Bahrain to Yemen and elsewhere. So really, any hope or any feeling by anyone that Russia or the US or regional states like Turkey, Iran, Saudi Arabia, or the regime itself care or want to promote Syrian or anyone else's self-determination and freedoms and security, it's ridiculous. It's a ridiculous assumption, you know?
we need to look into the conversation and really break it down very simply. When someone is anti-imperialist, I really want to understand, how do they define imperialism, and how do they define being anti that? Because I assume when we are anti-imperialistic, and I would like to say I'm part of that, I'm against what the actions and functions and discourses and mentalities of imperialism. And one of the key things of that is dehumanizing people and expressions of power. Now, when we look at the Assad regime, let's just look at the Assad regime alone, without everyone else at play. What is the Assad regime? And let's be very honest about that. I mean, we can ignore what happened since 2011. Fine. Let's look pre-2011. How did that regime function? And I can assure you, based on what I know from my experiences and my family and friends and the things I've read from different sources, that this is not really a great regime. And I'm using that very diplomatically. It's a very monstrous, repressive, brutal regime. So saying that doesn't mean that I am with U.S. invasions and occupations of the region. I am wholly against that. And I find that there is no contradiction. And this is something that we need to start talking and realizing about. I can understand, and I really do understand, the reasoning or rationality of caution within the anti-imperialist front, which we could see from recent examples of Iraq. Iraq wasn't that long ago. It was 14 years ago. I get that. I understand what the Anglo-American invasion and occupation of Iraq was a lie, and it was absolutely devastating for the Iraqi communities and people and the region. At the same time, we also need to evolve our thinking. We can stand against those schemes without justifying or enabling a dictatorship. There should be that position. And I don't see why that is such a controversial or strange position to take. It's very normal to be against oppression of any form. That's what we should be doing, and that supposedly, in my opinion, will divide us from the imperialists or the warmongers or the oppressors, you know?
Mm-hmm.
I hope that makes sense.
Yes, that did make sense. And so how do you think that as Western allies, I guess, of Syrian people, we can help, what sort of policies can we push for, and what ideological positionings can we support in order to be with the best, or advocate for the best interest of the Syrian people?
Well, when we talk about Western allies, so if we're talking about Western Europe and North America, I think one of the first very simple things in policy that can be pushed for or fought for is opening the borders for refugees. I think this is a very, very easy, clear, shouldn't be a controversial thing to be against. Opening the borders and treating people that come in as human beings with dignity. I mean, this is very simple, and there shouldn't be anyone that supposedly is in the anti-imperialist front who are against. Secondly, I think there needs to be a sort of internal reflections that is the discourses being used or arguments being used supporting different forms of oppression. I mean, we need to be careful about falling into the war on terror rhetoric, and this has happened across the fold. And that enables repression. It enables states to continue to do what they want to do with their foreign wars and even internal forms of war on people. So that is another thing. And at the same time, I think trying to really broaden our visions, broaden our forms of action. I mean, there is something to be said about solidarity and working across lines, you know? And that, through that, I think you can help more and more. Now, in terms of Syria specifically, listening to Syrian voices, giving a platform, passing the mic, you know? Pass the mic. There are a lot of Syrians better than me who can be talking, and I think that is important to take into account. And even when you think about it, when you open the borders for Syrian refugees, bring them in, treat them right, and listen to their stories. And I think you'll understand more and more the dynamics and the picture that is happening in Syria. That is important. I think these are very basic things.
Mm-hmm. And also, you were saying before when we were speaking that pushing for progressive causes and progressive forces in our own like respective lives can be helpful.
Yeah, I do think so. I mean, I tend to look at it in a very holistic way. Fighting for a progressive cause in a place like Paris or New York and achieving gains help someone else in another place in this globe. And we can't forget that. Even the tiny victories are important. And I know that sounds idealistic, but it matters. It matters in the long run if we're looking at things from, taking a step back in time and looking at the bigger picture. That matters. And also by being allies to different causes. I mean, when we criticize the reactions to the April 7th airstrike, one of the biggest criticisms that I think was valid was that there was suddenly this urgency to do protests, right? Protests over a strike on an airbase, when this urgency for not doing it for Syrians that were killed a week before by American airstrikes alone in a mosque or in a bakery, that urgency was, or that was very striking. Or the fact that this same protests weren't continuing against Russian strikes, or Syrian regime strikes, or even opposition strikes. I mean, that's what people should be protesting for. They should be protesting for Syrians and their right to self-determination and their lives, not for their side or against the side they hate. I mean, this is not a game, right? They're playing a game. We shouldn't be playing a game,
Right. Yeah, it seems like if the interests of the protests were solely to advocate on behalf of the Syrian people, they would be going on at all hours of every day, right?
Right? Like today, I mean, who's killing Syrians? Recently, there was a horrible massacre where I assume it was the armed opposition used a car bomb on buses leaving Sawaa and Kafara. This is a massacre, and this is horrible. At the same time, the regime has been bombing places like Douma, killing civilians, and this has been going on. This should stop. We should be all banding together against all forms of repression. I think that's very clear. And that logic, that reasoning, should extend to other forms of repression we see around the world, whether small or big. We should be immediately against that and be allies on causes against that. I think so.
This segues nicely, into my next question, which is about the connection. If there is a connection between what is going on in Syria, what happened in Afghanistan with, the mother of all bombs less than a week ago being dropped in the country, and also what is going on in Yemen, what's going on in Mosul and Iraq. If you can talk a little bit about, is there a connection, and if so, what is that connection?
I mean, the connection it doesn't have to be tangible. It could be something very immaterial. For me, a lot of the connection within the region between Iraq, Syria, and Yemen, for example, and even Bahrain and Palestine, is that we're all part of the same geographical space. And our movements are influenced by everyone else's movements and what was happening, especially in 2010, 2011. And we can't disconnect from that. That also ties into, if we expand the circle away from our regional geography, which is known as the Middle East or West Asia or whatever you want to call it, to something greater. What's happening in Afghanistan, of course, matters. I think the mother of all bombs that was dropped on Afghanistan is a sign and a continuation of American imperialism in many ways, which is a response to what the Russians are doing. One could even make an argument that the airstrike that happened on April 7th Donald Trump made the call to do that airstrike before sitting down and having cake with the Chinese president. And that could have been a sign on North Korea. So all these things are obviously connected in many ways. So what we need to realize as well is that the forces of elites or capitalism or whatever you want to call it, the global powers, the superpowers, are interacting in many ways. They are tied. And our movements should be tied as well. We should be interacting, being allies, working together, networking. Because they're doing that on top. We should be doing that on the bottom.
In your opinion, is there a military solution to the conflict in Syria?
That is a very intriguing
I know
question.
that's a very loaded question, but
No,
I mean, because I think in the abstract, I agree that all oppressions should kind of, or people from all different sides of the oppression should like band together and advocate for liberation.
Yeah.
But in practice, what would that look like?
Oh, that's a crazy
I'm sort of like
question,
asking you to
but-
determine my whole life right now.
No, it's okay. It's all right. I think that's a very interesting question. I mean, how do we define military intervention? Let me ask people this. If states or people can collect together and send anti-aircraft weaponry to the armed opposition, would that be acceptable? I mean, the regime uses air power against the armed opposition, which harms a lot of civilians. Would anti-aircraft weaponry be sort of acceptable? Because you can't really, like the dynamics of it. It's supposedly a defensive military weapon. Would that be acceptable? I don't know. I don't have easy answers. I'm also aware that I am personally not comfortable with the idea of getting weapons from, the Gulf, the GCC countries, or Europe, or America, because of history, right? They tend to come with strings attached, and their interests aren't really aligning with my self-determination interests, especially the Gulf, especially the GCC. But at the same time, I'm also aware that you're going to have to fight against an oppressive regime. I mean, there has to be some kind of military option available or considered. People need to fight back when the regime is bombing. So it's not a simple question, like, do I support military intervention or not?
I guess
Somewhat,
I'm talking about, like,
maybe.
international military intervention.
What is international military intervention?
Like the
Because,
US.
again,
Right.
NATO wasn't really great in Libya. They completely shattered the country and left, and Libya is a horrendous strait. And the UN isn't really doing a great job. Look at the UN in different places. I mean, you have scandal after scandal after scandal. So the question I perhaps can pose is that if the systems and structures for military intervention are not working for us today as people, perhaps we need to create a new one? I don't know. Perhaps there needs to be, a leftist, mercenary, anti-imperialist, progressive militia that goes in. I have no idea. Maybe we can collect and create a fund that gives money to local Syrian villages to defend themselves. Mm-hmm. Is that appropriate? I don't know. These aren't simple questions, but we should have this dialogue and this debate very openly, even when we don't agree, and we can set limits. We can all agree we don't want the U.S. to invade and occupy Syria, and I'm all for that. But we also should agree, at least, that there are not a lot of peaceful options with the Assad regime. I mean, let's talk about political dialogue, and I'm open to political dialogue, but with conditions. And I have a right to these conditions, and my condition is accountability. I really, really believe that any type of political dialogue that happens in Syria between the armed opposition and the regime should include accountability for both parties in terms of the crimes they have done, and both have done many, many crimes on the Syrian people. And I would argue the regime has done more in terms of magnitude and scale. But they should all be held account to their crimes. And then we can have political discussions. Mm-hmm. At the same time, is that realistic? I know people will argue we just want the bloodshed to end. And I see that as well. Because war at the same time cannot continue. The suffering is a lot. So there aren't really simple solutions here. The answer to military intervention isn't simply a yes or a no. We should be saying how, what, when, why. Like, these things that we should divulge into. And it's not going to be easy because the situation isn't easy, The solutions aren't easy.
Could you talk a little bit about the work that you do with Doctors Without Borders?
I mean, Doctors Without Borders helps the situation in the best way it can as a medical humanitarian emergency organization. And my work involving, I deal with communication. So I deal with creative content. I do things like documentaries to an animated film or an open discussion event. So in terms of when you're talking about helping, for Syria at least, what I know they do is that they provide medical help. And I think medical help alone is very important, regardless of which side you're on or whatever. People deserve every right, and it's no compromise on access to medical care. And Doctors Without Borders does provide that to the degree it can. So I like that. I know I do like that. And I guess it's helping in a small degree. I think in terms of what everyone else can do is you do what you can, and we all have a part to play, whether in our own environments or on the topic of Syria. And we should try and do what we can. I mean, with my experiences, what really was enlightening to me, at least with Doctors Without Borders, is that I had the opportunity to work in places like Yemen and go to Iraq for a bit, a very, very short time. And it really helped me broaden my horizons and my understandings. I mean, what I've seen in Yemen and Iraq is a very miserable situation, and that relates to a lot of the internal politics of what's happening in both countries. At the same time, the responsibility falls on regional states and the harm they've caused on both countries, and international states, 100%. So I see in both Yemen and Iraq a sort of reflection of what I see with the communities in Syria in terms of the suffering and the bitter sense of hope for a better future, and just the shattering that happens to human beings, their bodies and their mentalities and their societies. It's depressing, but at the same time, there's a sense of defiance. There's a sense of striving on and trying to live and adapt. That to me is quite powerful. I mean, even when you're in utter disarray or in utter shit, if I can use that term, you still move on. You go on. You have to. And some people don't. I'll be honest. I've seen people that have given up, and I don't judge them for doing so. But more people move on, and I think that is something we have to remind ourselves as well. Like, there's a sense of defiance there. Sense that they live.
And to finish off, could you tell us where you get your news from Syria, and what are the main websites or the main sources that you would recommend, or the main authors, journalists that we can follow?
I mean, let's be frank. The mainstream media isn't really a good space, and I would include Russia Today as part of mainstream media. And I think that's something people need to realize. When we say mainstream media, Russia Today is mainstream. It's incredible.
Weren't you on Russia Today?
I was
Yeah.
about Charlie Hebdo, and it was an interesting experience actually. But it's mainstream media. So it has, and don't forget that it represents a country that is involved militarily. So there are interests in terms of its discourse, just like how CNN and other American websites were orgasming over the strike and talking about how beautiful it was.
Oh my God, yeah, that was so weird.
So this is mainstream media for you. In terms of Syria, I think the best ways to get a better understanding is to read a lot of voices of different Syrians, even if you oppose them. Read different types of Syrian bloggers, writers. You would have to know Arabic mainly, because a lot of the best ones are in Arabic. But in English, you can find a whole bunch of them in different sources, and that's what I would read. And I would also try to talk to Syrians more and more, try to be open and listen. And it's basically trying to understand a whole tapestry of different narratives and seeing what makes sense, And that's what I do. I don't I don't read just one source or one website. This is it. I try as much as I can to read sources that are also from the ground, whether it's on Twitter or the independent news sites that open up by collectives. They have their biasness, but they're also interesting sources of information. I mean, a lot of these sources are on Facebook as well. These are the platforms, because there's nothing formal here, and we have to realize this is a good and bad thing. We're trying to get information from very non-official, informal platforms. And I think that maybe has to let us rethink our ideas of where we get our information, what is truth, Thank you so much for having me.
Yeah, thank you so much for coming on the show, and can come back anytime, obviously.
Well, so I wasn't boring you, huh?
No, not at all. Not at all. And we've actually been on Skype for nearly 2 hours, so this video was just a small part of our conversation. But yeah, I really appreciate it, and thank you so much.
Thank you so much for having me, and good luck.
All right, so quickly before I sign off, I just wanted to say I hope that you enjoyed the video. I would love to hear from you in the comments section down below. Don't forget to check out the links in the description box if you enjoyed this conversation. And I also just wanted to give another huge thank you to Yazan Al-Saadi for generously agreeing to film this video with me, which I thought was so fascinating. And yeah, I'm just really grateful that I had this opportunity. So if you enjoyed it, please share it around, and I'll see you shortly in my next video. Bye!